She was just 12, a barefoot orphan living alone in a crooked cabin by the edge of Russian Creek. No family, no neighbors, just the water, the trees, and the wind. But what Emmy Rose did that morning, in the misty hush before sunrise, would draw 500 warriors to her doorstep like thunder chasing lightning. The sun had barely risen, its soft amber fingers just brushing the treetops, when she heard it, a cry, sharp and desperate, echoing through the morning fog like a wound. Tearing open, Emmy froze mid-step, the wooden bucket slipping from her fingers and thudding against the creek rocks. Her heart stuttered as she peered across the rising water. There, on the far bank where the wild grass bent low from last night's storm, a girl was crumpled in the mud, failing to stand, her leg bent the wrong way, grotesquely, painfully, a twist no human body should bear. Most settlers would have turned their backs, swallowed the sound, and shut their doors tight. Tensions had been pulsing like a heartbeat between frontier folk and the native tribes, tightening, thickening, ready to snap. Just last week, Silas Morrison warned the entire trading post not to stray near native lands, said the prairie wouldn't be so forgiving this season. But Emmy Rose had never done what most people did. She watched the girl through the mist, saw the tremble in her limbs and the silent cry in her dark eyes. The creek between them had swollen from recent rains, the current slick and swift, thick with debris and cold as a grave. Emmy could feel its hunger from where she stood, pulling, reaching. It could swallow a man whole, let alone a child, injured and alone. The girl tried once more to rise, her scream muffled by the wind, before collapsing back onto the wet bank. Emmy's heart ached in her chest like a bruise being pressed, and then she moved, not out of thought, but out of instinct. She kicked off her boots, waded barefoot into the icy flood, teeth clenched against the cold that bit her bones. The current hit her hard, yanking at her knees, trying to steal her balance. With every step, mossy stones shifted underfoot, slippery as secrets. Twice, she stumbled, arms flailing, lungs tight with panic. The water rose to her waist, then her ribs, her dress dragging her down like wet cement. But she didn't stop. The native girl was watching her now, unmoving, but her eyes alive with disbelief. Emmy kept going. By the time she reached the opposite shore, both girls were shaking, breathless. The injured girl spoke a flurry of words, foreign and beautiful, but Emmy didn't need to know the language. The gratitude in her voice was clear as spring water. Emmy pointed to the creek, then to herself. She knelt, helping the girl drape an arm over her narrow shoulders, then began the journey back, this time carrying not only her own weight, but the weight of another. Every step back felt like a gamble with death. The current clawed at them, the girl's pain radiating like heat against Emmy's side. They slipped, nearly lost their footing, but Emmy gritted her teeth and pressed on. Driven by something deeper than fear, they collapsed on the near bank like broken reeds. Emmy's skin was scraped, her lungs burned, and the girl's leg had swollen, alarmingly. But they were alive. Together, Emmy helped the girl inside her small cabin, tucked her near the fireplace, fed the flames higher until their shivering eased. She cleaned the girl's wounds with trembling hands and scraps of cloth, torn from her own skirts. She had no training, no real idea what she was doing, but she worked carefully, gently, speaking in soft tones even when her words weren't understood. The girl's dark eyes followed her movements with quiet intensity. She spoke sometimes soft syllables in her native tongue, and though Emmy couldn't understand, she listened. There was something regal about the girl. Despite the mud and pain, the intricate beadwork of her dress, the craftsmanship of her boots, she wasn't just anyone. But to Emmy, she was simply a child who needed help. That was enough. They spent the day together, silence peppered with gestures and hesitant smiles. Emmy offered her only food, a few root vegetables and hard biscuits. The girl accepted each offering with gratitude, even as her eyes kept drifting toward the window, toward the horizon, where clouds gathered low and slow. By evening, the girl had grown more animated, gesturing insistently, pointing westward, speaking with urgency. Emmy could only nod and hope she'd done enough. As night settled in, the girl refused rest. Instead, she took up Emmy's needle and thread and began working by firelight, stitching something into a square of cloth, her fingers moving with focus and care. Emmy fell asleep to the sound of the creek outside, unaware that the girl she'd carried across the flood was Ayanna, the beloved daughter of Chief Takakota, leader of the largest, fiercest tribe in the entire territory. What Emmy also didn't know was that Ayanna had been missing for 2 days, that hundreds of warriors had been searching the land with growing desperation, convinced she'd been captured or worse by settlers, and in her grief, Chief Takakota had promised blood for his daughter's life. But Ayanna, under Emmy's roof, had other plans. While Emmy slept, Ayanna finished her embroidery, threading into that cloth a symbol of rare power, a bird in flight, a hand in peace, a call, a declaration, a map. Emmy was jolted awake by sound, deep, rhythmic, primal, drums, echoing through the valley like distant thunder, each beat sharp as a blade, building like a storm on the edge of thought. She sat bolt upright, heart galloping. Ayanna was already awake, sitting upright by the fire, clutching the cloth with both hands. Her face was alert, eyes bright with anticipation, and something close to worry. She pointed to the window, speaking quickly, the tension in her voice unmistakable. Emmy stumbled to the small glass pane and looked out. The darkness beyond had changed. The valley no longer slept. Dozens no. Hundreds of campfires flickered like stars fallen to earth, stretching across the valley in every direction. Between the firelight, shadows moved. Drums thundered louder, joined by chants, voices rising in unison. Ancient and unstoppable. This wasn't chaos. This was ceremony. Ayanna hobbled over, gripping Emmy's hand. She pressed the embroidered cloth into her palm and spoke a single word, her voice soft but firm. It sounded like friend. Emmy stared at the symbol, elegant, precise, a winged bird, a reaching hand. Peace and strength woven together. Outside, the figures moved closer, the chanting more defined now, the presence undeniable. Was it a rescue? A reckoning? Stories rushed back, Silas Morrison's tales of settlements swallowed in one night, of vengeance sweeping through the frontier like wildfire. But Ayanna looked calm, proud. She pointed to the symbol, to Emmy, then to her own heart. Her meaning was crystal clear. You are part of this now. Then came the hoof beats, like 100 heartbeats, hounding against the earth. The dawn broke golden and trembling, spilling light across the cabin as the sound of 500 horses came to a halt. Just beyond the door, the drumming stopped, cut off like breath in a grave. A hush fell so complete it felt deafening. Emmy held the embroidered cloth tight in her fist, her legs weak beneath her. Outside, leather creaked, warriors dismounted, weapons glinted in the sun's first kiss. Through the trembling walls, she could hear them, not angry, not shouting, murmurs, reverent. Ayanna limped to the door, hand poised on the latch. She turned. Once, her eyes locking with Emmy's, an unspoken promise in her gaze. Then she opened the door and stepped into the dawn. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, cries, joy. Every head turned toward the girl once thought lost. Warriors dropped to their knees, hands clutched over hearts. Some wept. At the center of the sea of warriors sat a man on a towering white horse, massive, still, eyes like winter steel. Even from here, Emmy felt his presence. Chief Takakota, a mountain in flesh. He raised one hand. Silence dropped over the valley like a shroud. His gaze shifted to the cabin, to the doorway where his daughter stood, bruised, but alive, into the girl behind her, pale and trembling, but upright. He saw them both. Emmy didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if she'd be thanked or punished. But in that sacred stillness, with Ayanna's cloth pressed to her chest, she understood one thing. She had changed everything. A low, rising sound swelled from hundreds of throats. No war cry, no scream of vengeance, but a raw, reverent sound that shimmered with relief and joy. It swept through the valley like a tide. Warm and thunderous, one by one, warriors dismounted, dropping to one knee, their eyes fixed not on the cabin, but on the girl standing before it. A chant began to ripple through their ranks, ancient and melodic, carried in their native tongue like a hymn woven with awe. Chief Takakota's stern face, carved from years of leadership and loss, broke open the moment his gaze landed on Ayanna. He leapt from his stallion with a fluidity that defied his massive frame. striding toward his daughter with arms nearly trembling at his sides. But he stopped short, his breath hitching visibly, when he saw her leg, the twisted angle of it, the way she leaned heavily on her uninjured side. Concern overtook his features, followed quickly by the seething edge of restrained fury. It wasn't rage at her, but something darker and older: fear, helplessness, the ghost of what could have been. Ayanna spoke quickly, her voice rushing in urgent tones as she gestured toward the cabin. Emmy's name rose clear above the foreign syllables, threaded through with words sharp with meaning and tinged with gratitude. Takakota's eyes flicked to the small wooden door where Emmy still hid, tracking between his daughter's impassioned explanation and the unseen figure who had saved her. Confusion passed through his expression, first then astonishment, then something softer, more reverent. Then Ayanna lifted the cloth she had stitched through the long, silent hours of the night. She held it high, the embroidered symbol glowing faintly in the morning light, the bird mid-flight, the hand extended in peace. The message was unmistakable in its grace and purpose. Takakota's gaze settled on the cloth, and the change was immediate. His eyes widened as if he'd seen a ghost or a prophecy fulfilled. He barked out sharp commands to his warriors, his voice slicing through the air like the strike of an eagle's wing dot in a heartbeat. The warriors moved. They dismounted swiftly, moving into formation not for battle, but for ceremony. Circles formed with precision, lines adjusted with practiced grace. Emmy watched all of it from the window, frozen in place. Her breath came shallow, her fingers white-knuckled on the edge of the door frame. She had never felt smaller, never more alone, more fragile. Her little cabin, her whole world, suddenly stood in the center of something vast, ancient, and terrifyingly unknown. Then Ayanna turned and called out to her, her voice clear and firm, but gentle. Emmy couldn't understand the words, but she understood the intent. She didn't answer, couldn't. Her feet felt rooted, her chest tight. Then Chief Takakota spoke. His voice was low but powerful, a deep resonance that flowed through the still air. Emmy couldn't make out the meaning, but it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an invitation. And still, she stood frozen, watching through warped glass as 500 warriors waited in disciplined silence. What did they want from her? What did the symbol mean? Could kindness really be enough to bridge the canyon between them? As the sunlight crept across the faces of the gathered men, casting long shadows and fire gold halos across their war-painted skin, Emmy knew she had to decide. She could remain inside, hoping the moment would pass, or she could step out into a storm of unknowns, carrying nothing but the truth of what she'd done. Her hand trembled as she reached for the latch. Every nerve in her body screamed to stay hidden, to wait, to breathe. But Ayanna was still calling, gently, her tone never wavering, and her father stood unmoving beneath the weight of expectation and silence. Emmy whispered a prayer into the folds of her breath, half to God, half to the wind, and opened the door. The world outside greeted her not with violence, but with silence. She stepped out, barefoot on the dewy grass, and the sheer stillness of it all nearly undid her. 500 warriors turned as one. Circles of painted horses, spears, feathers, eyes, so many eyes watched her in complete silence. It felt like standing before a tidal wave held at bay by a single breath. Chief Takakota stepped forward, up close. He was even more formidable, taller than any man Emmy had ever seen, his shoulders wide enough to eclipse the sun. His long black hair fell down his back in braids adorned with feathers and small, polished bones. War paint striped his face in bold, deliberate marks, stories written in color across his weathered skin. But his dark eyes, when they met hers, carried none of the wrath she had feared. They held something else, something deeper than words could hold. He placed his right hand over his heart and bowed deeply. Then he spoke. His voice, though foreign, was reverent, formal, solemn. Behind him, every warrior followed his lead. 500 heads bowed in unison, a ripple of honor and grace that made Emmy's knees quiver beneath her. Ayanna limped toward her, her face glowing with quiet pride. She took Emmy's hand and squeezed it with gratitude, then turned back to her father, speaking quickly, her voice layered with emotion. Emmy heard her own name again, and though the words were not hers to understand, The tone told her everything. Takakota listened with care, his nods slow and deliberate. Then he turned to Emi and addressed her directly, his tone filled with both authority and astonishment. He gestured toward Ayana's leg, then toward the creek, then back to Emi herself, as if assembling a story from fragments. Emi lowered her gaze, unsure how to respond, but Ayana remained at her side, hand warm in hers. Two warriors stepped forward bearing something carefully folded across their arms. When they opened it, Emi gasped. It was a robe massive, beautiful, and regal, made from buffalo hide as soft as silk. It shimmered with beads of white, gold, and sky blue. Every pattern told a story, every stitch sung with reverence. Takakota took the robe and held it out to her. Emi hesitated, overwhelmed. But Ayana gently nudged her forward, eyes bright with encouragement. With trembling hands, Emi accepted the garment. It was heavy and soft, every inch infused with care and tradition. And it wasn't the only gift. More warriors stepped forward. One by one, they offered her pieces of their world necklaces of polished stone, bowls carved from ancient wood, pouches of dried fruits and sacred herbs. Their offerings surrounded her like a tide of generosity. And still, more came. Emi stood in the center of it all, speechless, slowly realizing what this truly was. This wasn't simple gratitude. It was ritual, ceremony, a recognition steeped in culture and history. Ayana's embroidered symbol had meant something more than Emi could ever have imagined. Her act of compassion had been transformed, elevated into a sacred gesture. As the gifts piled at her feet, a commotion stirred in the crowd. An older woman was making her way forward, and the warriors parted for her like wind through wheat. She walked with poise and gravity, silver threaded through her long black hair. Her dress so richly beaded it glittered like a night sky. Ayana's face lit up. She whispered, "Mother," in the only word Emi could understand. The woman reached them and embraced Ayana gently, careful not to touch her injury. Then she turned to Emi. Her dark eyes brimmed with tears, and as she approached, her movements were reverent, slow. Emi barely registered what was happening until the woman knelt and pressed her forehead to Emi's hands. It was too much. Takakota stepped forward, speaking sharply, as if insisting his wife rise. But the woman shook her head and remained kneeling, her voice a prayer of gratitude and blessing. Emi felt the hot drip of tears land on her skin as the woman honored her in the most sacred way. She knew, when she finally rose, she removed the necklace from her own neck, a piece of silver so fine it seemed spun from moonlight, a single stone in its center flickering like fire in a mirror. She draped it gently round Emi's neck, adjusting it with the careful tenderness of a mother dressing her child. Ayana leaned close and translated what she could. She pointed to Emi's heart, then to her family, then to the valley beyond. "You are one of us now." Takakota stepped forward again, lifting his voice for all to hear. He addressed his warriors in a speech that rang across the hills, deep and resonant. Emi didn't understand the words, but the crowd's response echoed with fierce approval, cheers, chants, the raising of weapons to the sky. They were pledging something, not just to him, but to her. Then Takakota turned to Emi, and with Ayana gently guiding her forward, she stepped into the space before him. He laid a massive hand on her shoulder and spoke in a voice meant for memory. The warriors exploded into jubilation. Hooves pounded, horses reared, arms were raised, and the valley rang with joyous cries. It was not the end of something, but the birth of something new, something precious. Emi stood in the heart of a celebration that felt like a sunrise, overwhelmed, trembling, forever changed. But it wasn't over. Takakota raised his hand again, calling for silence, and when it came, he turned toward Emi's small, lopsided cabin, speaking slowly, carefully. Several warriors moved at once, approaching the structure with cautious hands and scanning eyes. Their concern was obvious. Ayana, still holding Emi's hand, tried to explain, pointing from the cabin to her father and back to the gathered warriors. There was urgency now in her voice, a clarity of purpose. They weren't just thanking Emi. They were preparing to build something, a future, a home, a life for the girl who had saved their daughter and, in doing so, become family. Emi stood at the edge of her cabin, watching as small clusters of warriors rode off in different directions. They weren't dispersing aimlessly, they moved with purpose, like pieces of a larger design being carefully set into motion. The sunlight had risen fully now, casting golden rays over the valley. But even the beauty of the morning couldn't distract Emmy from the truth blooming inside her. What had begun as a simple act, pulling an injured girl from the cold embrace of a creek, had grown into something vast and intricate, a force far beyond anything she had anticipated. The orphan who had once fallen asleep alone in a drafty, weather-worn cabin had awakened, to find herself standing at the very heart of a major tribal decision. She didn't know what they had ultimately chosen, or how it would shape her days to come. But one thing was painfully clear: her life would never be the same. The warriors who had inspected her home returned to Chief Takakota, their expressions confirming what Emmy already knew deep in her bones. Her little shelter, so modest, so poorly cobbled together, was woefully inadequate. It was barely fit for a single person, much less a girl they now considered family. The chief listened silently, nodding at their assessment. He didn't interrupt, but his face darkened with concern as they spoke of loose boards, a roof that leaked with the faintest drizzle, and a near absence of proper supplies. He turned to Emmy then, speaking in tones both gentle and resolute. Though his words were in his native language, Ayana did her best to translate with broken English and sweeping gestures. Emmy began to understand. They weren't just thankful, they were worried. Worried about her safety, worried about her being alone, worried that as winter crept closer, this girl who had shown such selfless courage might vanish into the cold. What happened next left Emmy breathless, with a single command from Chief Takakota. The quiet awe of the morning transformed into a storm of purposeful movement. Warriors unloaded their horses with bundles of wood, tools, and tightly wrapped materials. Skilled craftsmen moved toward her cabin like artists approaching a blank canvas. In minutes, the dull rhythm of hammers and saws filled the air, but there was no chaos, only mastery. These were not mere repairs, this was transformation. They worked with practiced fluidity, stripping away weak boards and sealing the gaps in her walls with a mixture that seemed to harden like stone. The sagging roof was replaced with angled timber designed to shed rain and snow alike. Emmy's simple shelter became something else entirely. Rooms began to emerge, new spaces, wide and solid, built with materials that seemed to come from nowhere. Carvings were etched into the beams, flowing designs of animals, rivers, and symbols she couldn't yet understand, but which pulsed with meaning. And then came Chief Takakota's wife once more, her eyes warm and watchful. In her arms she carried folded garments, thick and vibrant. Emmy reached out cautiously, her fingers brushing against fabrics softer than anything she'd ever worn, robes lined with fur, stitched with beadwork that shimmered like the morning frost. These clothes were clearly made not just to protect, but to honor. They carried artistry and tradition within every thread. Ayana explained through gestures and a few tender words that these were not simply gifts. They were a statement of faith, a preparation for a life no longer lived in solitude or survival, but within a circle of care. This tribe was making room for Emmy not only in their territory, but in their future. Then, with a voice like a river made of thunder, Chief Takakota called for silence once again. The entire crowd hushed instantly. Even those hammering her roof paused, heads tilted, eyes focused. The chief spoke slowly, his tone weighty and unwavering. Whatever he was saying, it carried sacred gravity. When he finished, the response that came was not cheers nor chanting, but something deeper. The sound that rose from the crowd was low, steady, and powerful, like the voice of the earth agreeing to something ancient and binding. Ayana turned toward Emmy with tears glimmering in her eyes, her voice catching with emotion as she whispered a single word in English, "Sister." The weight of that word hit Emmy harder than anything she had felt that day. Somehow, in the act of saving Ayana's life, she had awakened customs far older than herself, rituals and bonds that stretched across generations. She was no longer just an outsider who had offered help. She was being welcomed into the bloodline of one of the most powerful families in the land. Chief Takakota approached again, standing before her with a solemn, unshakable expression. He placed both of his massive hands on her shoulders and spoke directly to her. the deep rumble of his voice soft but profound, though she couldn't understand his language. The emotion in his words pierced her heart. There was reverence there, and pride. A vow, a promise spoken through generations. Ayanna translated slowly, choosing each English word with care. My father says, you are now daughter of our people. The creek that brought you together, it will always flow between our lands and yours. But you will never be alone again. Tears streamed freely down Emmy's cheeks. What had started as a cold, dangerous moment in rushing water had rippled outward into something miraculous. She wasn't just accepted, she was claimed, chosen. The transformation of her home was nearly complete now, and Emmy could hardly believe the sight. Glass windows gleamed in the sunlight. The structure stood taller, prouder, the carvings along the eaves telling the story of two worlds intertwining. It was no longer a cabin. It was a home, a monument to healing and a hope. Chief Takakota's wife returned one last time, carrying a carved wooden chest bound in leather. Inside lay gifts more precious than gold to a frontier girl, seeds for planting, medicinal herbs gathered from secret places, gleaming tools shaped for survival, and enough preserved food to outlast any blizzard. And still these material things, as wondrous as they were, couldn't compare to what Chief Takakota said next. He announced that a group of young warriors would remain nearby, not as guards, not as overseers, but as family, helpers, companions, supporters. Emmy would retain her independence, her solitude if she desired it, but she would never again be vulnerable or forgotten. As the day wore on, a remarkable shift occurred. From across the valley, settlers emerged, drawn by the unfamiliar sight of hundreds of native warriors gathered peacefully in one place. Many came hesitantly, expecting confrontation, but what they found shattered every expectation. They witnessed love, not just respect, but something deeper surrounding a girl who had once been invisible to the world. Silas Morrison, once the loudest voice warning against native contact, stood silent, his mouth agape, watching as the formidable Chief Takakota embraced Emmy like a beloved daughter. Old fears and divisions began to crack and crumble under the weight of what was unfolding. A new kind of bridge had been built, one forged not by treaties or trade, but by humanity and grace. As the golden sun dipped below the ridge line and the sky turned the color of burning embers, Chief Takakota gathered his warriors for the journey home. But before they mounted their horses, he approached Emmy one final time. He touched the silver necklace around her neck, the one his wife had given her, and he spoke in a tone that made every warrior fall silent. Ayanna stood beside Emmy, her voice trembling as she translated. He says, this necklace belonged to his mother, and her mother before that. It has never been worn by anyone outside his bloodline. Until now, the 500 warriors who had come at dawn began their return beneath a sky now glittering with stars. But Emmy didn't watch them go. Her eyes remained on her new home, on the windows that now shimmered like eyes full of stories, on the carvings that whispered of unity, on the necklace heavy against her chest. She was no longer Emmy Rose, the forgotten orphan who lived beside a lonely creek. She was Emmy Rose, daughter of two peoples, a living bridge between cultures, proof that even the smallest act of kindness could ripple across the world and return as a tidal wave of change. Outside her window, the creek still babbled, but it no longer sounded like loneliness. It sang of something eternal, something sacred, something that would never be forgotten.